Welcome, everyone. This is Poets in Conversation. I'm Phyllis Klein, and I hope things are good where you're tuning in from. I want to continue to hold space for all those who are in peril. I found a poem by Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, who died in 2000, that speaks to me about the need to think about other people's burdens and circumstances. This small poem hits on so many tragic human conditions. I've been reading the book James, which I highly recommend, which is a retelling of a Huck Finn novel. And it has also slashed my heart with its stories about the treatment of slaves here in the United States. So here's the Amichai poem. The Butterfly's Burden. You who live secure in your warm houses, who return at evening to find hot food and friendly faces. Consider whether this is a man who labors in the mud, who knows no peace, who fights for a crust of bread, who dies at a yes or a no. Consider this is a woman without hair or name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her room cold like a frog in winter. So now let me tell you about tonight's honored guests, Helena Mesa and Shannon Winston, two friends, professors of poetry, and consummate poets. Helena lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a place near to my heart because I went to grad school there. And Shannon, who has lived in a lot of places, moved on from there to settle currently in Indiana. Good. Got that right. Helena's second book, Where Land Is Indistinguishable from Sea, focuses on love, romantic, and familial. She considers distance, physical and emotional, and questions how we love across great distances. She writes about loneliness and being left alone as a kid with her sister. Her mother is a Cuban exile, so there's also the distance of that home, the departure from it, and returning there for a visit with Helena and her sister 10 years ago for the first time after fleeing Cuba in the early 1960s. Shannon's book, which is her first, is a collection of ekphrastic poems inspired by museums and artwork that has meaning for her. She takes us through the canvas to show us something new and unknowable about ourselves. This is what Matthew Olsman says on the back cover of her book. She shares her own pain about the loss of her father at age 10 as one example. Shannon's book takes a painting and enlivens it with emotions so it breathes and expresses itself right off the page of the book. These poets share their vulnerabilities, hopes, difficulties, and wounds in such creative and nuanced ways, bringing us in close and holding us there with the power of connection, empathy, and tremendous skill. And so now I'm going to ask Shannon to introduce Helena.
That was so beautiful and really wonderful, and did a great job of capturing our work. So I'll I'm gonna riff a little, talk about Helena's bio, but also our history together as friends and poets. So I met Helena through a mutual friend at a time when I wasn't really sure how much space poetry would have in my life. I always loved poetry, but at the time I was studying comparative literature at Michigan, which I liked, but it was never my true passion. And I found that doing the critical work of a PhD kind of crowded out the creative work of poetry. And so some of my fondest memories of Helena include meeting her at the local coffee shop and talking about poetry and talking about how to teach poetry and which poets we were studying. And she just over the years has become this amazing friend and collaborator of ideas and images, and someone who I have shared work with. And we were talking a little bit before the session that I really admire the ways in which she can take an image and dig deeper in her poetry to explore the metaphorical layers of that image. And as recently as last year, she came to the IU Writers Conference, and we had wonderful supplemental workshops on my porch where we poured over each other's manuscripts. And that's one of my best memories of Helena. So you all are in for a big treat tonight, listening to her work.
Thank you, Shannon. That was really wonderful. And I have to say, I'm super honored to be here. Many thanks to Phyllis and Lynn for making this happen, for everybody being here this evening. But it's a special honor for me to be reading with Shannon, just for a long friendship that is both poetic, but then also in terms of just genuine friendship. So I appreciate being here. I'm going to read some poems from the new collection for me. As Phyllis mentioned, some of the things that I was really thinking about was geographic and emotional distances, and like thinking about love and how we love and understand, well, distance, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I thought what I could do is start with the opening poem of the collection, just to give you a sense of the book's arc. The first poem is, I was really thinking about how the person you can know best can be an emotional stranger. And at the same time, I was thinking about how the person that you fantasize about is also an idealized stranger. So, love letter to a stranger with rain. Years ago, I read of an accident in a country far from our own. The medics arrived late, and as the ambulance pulled from the curb, the crowd sang, together, strangers making song of an end we fear. I'm saying this wrong. Why wait for the sirens? Why not sing like that now? This morning, a stillness, miles and miles of trees. Tell me, how do I reach you? Which road do I take? Which swimming hole will invite us, where the spring feeds from beneath and cools our feet? When rain fell on the tin roof yesterday, I thought I was in another country, the light more aged than yellow. And along one road, a swallowtail, its ice blue wings closing like a door. So a lot of the collection thinks about estrangement and disconnection in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to really focus on a poem that thinks about estrangement in a more surreal way, or metaphoric way, perhaps. Late. No one knows you. The guests already clustered, their backs all charmeuse, dipping low. The chatters not unfamiliar, though the words miss vowels, the sentences verbs. The room's design you recognize, bookcase, chairs, not the chandelier. Barefoot on the couch, you drum the leather, calling a stray cat to fill the space. Instead, waiters offer cocktail forks on silver trays. You ask for a dictionary. When you speak, the words seep reds, a horizon behind you. The guests turn and comment how hard it is to hear from such distance. So I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic grade school and a Catholic middle school. And so there's a lot of religious imagery that I bring into the collection, but then also try to subvert at moments. But one of the poems that I wanted to start off with some childhood poems. And one of the poems I was thinking about was a poem that was responding to the idea that what the nuns taught us in school, which was God is always with you, inside you, and knows everything. And it was something I found a little bit disconcerting as a child, because my understanding of that was that there was no private space and that any of the thoughts I was having could be a bad thought. And so this next poem is a poem that is really responding to that idea and that misunderstanding. The lesson. She said, "He is everywhere, even inside you." I felt my bones bow, my organs crowd with words. The thin black dog leaning against a white fence, the seamstress pricking her finger, my father sleeping at the end of the pew. Inside us all, he listened. A black phone with a stiff dial, connecting one mind to the next. I listened to the circuits of my body jam with sounds. Then a stillness I feared. Eve left the garden, she said. Eve disobeyed, and he marched her through gates leading nowhere, and nowhere stretches. He knew before she covered herself in leaves, before the core swarmed with bees. He lived inside her and felt the thought form. So one of the things I was thinking about is thinking about ideas of beauty that we form in childhood, and how our ideas of self-love and understanding really get shaped by the way we interact with other kids. And so this next poem was really thinking about how bullying can affect our understanding of self. Recess. The schoolyard scabbed with tar that stuck to our souls. The sky an upturned bowl that hung over us. Our bodies tired of stiff seats, of sit still, sing louder, silence. The nuns always watching, but deaf when our backs turned. Boys and girls hissing, Eddie Smella off Orihuela, his Spanish name, his dark hair and eyes, his gapped front teeth, all just like me. I hated the chorus of kids taunting, "Kiss her," the boy chasing me toward the chain link fence, their "Kiss Bucky," insistent, his lips stinging like a bee. My no, their laughter. Who else could kiss me? An ugly girl. Who else could he kiss but me? So as mentioned, my family's Cuban, and my sisters and I had always wanted to go to Cuba to see Havana and see where my family grew up, and to see the place from their perspective along with them. And so we refused to go until both of my parents agreed to go back. So this next poem is capturing a moment of visiting my mother's father's grave. So once we arrived on the island, the very first thing we wanted to do was to pay respects to my grandfather. My mother's father died when she was young. She was about 15 or 16 years old. And so if you've spent any time on an island, in a cemetery in an island, or maybe in New Orleans, you'll know that the graves are oftentimes above ground. And so what started to happen is that as the National Cemetery ran out of space, they started to exhume the bodies in order to make space for other loved ones. And so upon arriving at the cemetery, we learned that my mother's father's grave had been exhumed. So my mother, who does not express emotion very well, her response was to say whatever, and she stormed off and wouldn't say anything. And so the next poem is written in my imagining of my mother's voice, if she had allowed herself to both feel and not feel, but express the emotion in that discovery. The only other thing you might need to know, just as a quick reminder, is that Poseidon is the Greek god of the sea. So, prayer for the exhumation. Let Poseidon rise, his waters pooling off his crown and neck, rushing down his back and down his chest and off his hips, until his sea raises its head and arms over walls and down streets into this. These sleeping quarters framed north to south, east to west, streets crisscrossing, numbered and mapped, as neatly laid as our dead. Their arms folded, fingers interlaced. How we left him, certain he'd remain entombed. Its bleached stones warming every knuckle, rib, and tooth, marking his place in his ruin, until someone stole the plaque, pushed back the slab, and moved him from the grounds for his ground. My father gone for good. Let Poseidon crash the gates and sink these graves and immerse whatever still abides, still lives, deep in a swell that sloughs the island of its skin, until land and sea become one. Let fish feed along cobbled roads, dart through arches and gates as if coral reefs. Let whales breed near domes and birds alight on the tips of steeples and crosses. Let the horizon collapse into the murky water, the clear blue lost to silt and turmoil, as lost as my father. And years from now, if the sea recedes and walls dry and the first palms seed, let someone find the city and honor the remains, all who were and all who called this home, so our mourning can end, so together we might begin again. Offering. The cat in her shedding winter coat prances, meaning she has broken the neck of an unsuspecting mouse and laid it on the old brick patio in my lover's yard. She howls until we rise and step out into spring air, saying good, good bear. At times she shows her teeth before dropping down, exposing her side. And why not? Who hasn't destroyed out of love, then asked to be forgiven? So I wanted to read a poem I haven't read before, so I thought that might be kind of fun. But I also wanted to read it because it's spring, and across the street, my neighbor, who is this amazing gardener, his flowers are starting to come up. And I also wanted to read this because some years ago, at the very start of the pandemic, Shannon and I were in a generative workshop together, and so this is one of the poems that started in that workshop. So this is my pandemic poem. So it was written at that moment when we were really scared to leave our houses and our porches, and just crossing the street and looking at your neighbor's flowers and his poppies felt like a really scary, threatening thing. So duende with poppies. Orange heads atop two thin necks. Crep petals I want to pluck and eat. They're orange a sherbet. A mango skin I want to split to suck the seed. Its juice running down my arms. Rothko orange, neon orange, orange I'd wear in deep summer. Orange the sunlight would be, if given a choice. A chorus of baritones, a few tambourines. Orange cardigan my sister wore, lounging in my dream last night, her hand trailing the petals. She sang the song we all sang as children before we knew what the Spanish meant. Such joy for a man dying in war. If a field covered the entrance to the underworld, its grass would be orange, this orange, the orange of street cones blocking unfinished roads, the same orange hunters wear to announce they exist. DEFCON orange, fleeting orange, that the breeze peels back to a Merlot heart that clenches, releases, before the blossom flutters shut. So I'd just like to read two more for you. The next one is also a poem I've never gotten a chance to read, so I'm excited to hear that. It's a ghazal. So I wanted to read a poem that really spoke to the literal, physical, geographic distances. Some of the poems very much respond to my falling in love, and I was living in Michigan, and my partner was living in California. So there was a lot of longing across great distances, and trying to visit and be in the same place. So this ghazal is really a response to that. There is a little bit of Spanish. The Spanish is quasi-translated in the couplet. Hopefully it'll still make sense. Incantation. Not even flight patterns offer certainty tonight. Which words will bring you beside me tonight? The plane trembles over your state line. Mountains, plains. How do I map our geography tonight? Rain ferries across your streets, inverts the stars. Nearly asleep, I know snow muffles my eaves tonight. Once we lived together, our time marked by a season, a plan. Why think of that least tonight? Extrañar, to miss, as in, extraño tu voz en la mañana. Me extraña, as in, how odd your voice feels tonight. You say planes are also arrivals. Why is there always a suitcase half packed? Forgive my defeat tonight. These nights, these archipelagos of words, say skin, breath, tongue, say Helena here tonight. And I wanted to end on a poem. I was reading about Jose Marti, who's a Cuban poet, and he is very much considered to be like the heroic poet for a lot of Cuban exiles. And so I was just trying to read a little bit about him, and he was writing about the Cuban War of Independence. And there was this little tiny footnote about an unsubstantiated myth or legend. And the legend didn't really describe much, but I was kind of fascinated with it because the legend was very much about rebellion and resistance and the power of women and beauty. And so it resonated with me in part because of the political landscape and things were happening in our country at the time. And so this is me imagining that legend more fully. Legend. During the war, women hid messages inside white flowers, tucked in their hair. They crossed enemy lines, slipped the blossoms into soldiers' fists. What might win the war? A child's crown for her communion, an offering at a grave. The oval, the style, the stigma. What seemed to unfurl overnight took weeks, even years. Dream your hand plucks the bloom. its widest petals like porcelain, and a halo of bees skims your arms. Upon waking, walk to the docks, the bloom heavy behind your ear, and breathe in its sweet persistence, its scent of sea salt and gutted fish. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, thank you, Helena. That was really amazing reading. And I want to invite Shannon to come and join us too and talk a little bit. Muriel says a halo of bees. There's so many phrases. I just want to, I just wanted to even repeat what you just read. Upon waking, walk to the docks, the bloom heavy behind your ear. Okay. Okay, heavy behind your ear. Wow. And breathe in its sweet persistence, its scent of sea salt and gutted fish. So the sweet persistence next to the gutted fish. I mean, so the jam-packed way, this condensation of so much in so few words. At least that's kind of what I'm picking up. Would you agree with that, Shannon? What would you say?
Yeah, definitely. So I was trying to write all of the beautiful lines as Helena was reading, but then I realized I would be writing all of her lines down. So
Yeah.
I was struck by several things, and maybe we can talk about this later.
Mhm.
One is the relationship between statements and questions in your work, and you have such beautiful questions. And I wrote down a couple, including who hasn't destroyed out of love, and a lot of people
Mhm.
wrote that in the chat that spoke to them. Is there any private space? Being another one. And then how do I map our geography tonight? And so I was really struck by questions and then statements in your poems. And you don't have to answer this now, but food for thought for later. And then thinking about, and this is what Phyllis is talking about, the ways in which you combine physical description, especially of spaces, with abstraction. So for me, ice blue wings closing like a door, right? It's like, how do you, I found myself wondering, like, I'd love to get into Helena's head to figure out how she does
Right,
that.
right.
And then also my organ crowds with words. So kind of thinking about the body being full of words. And so those were just some threads that I picked out in your reading tonight.
Mhm.
Thanks for
Yeah.
noticing, observing all that. I think I I think one of the things that you both pointed to, which is something I try to do, is like the yoking of things, sometimes of those contrasting elements, the gutted fish with the sea salt or the sweet sea salt, but then also trying to combine the concrete with the abstract. So I'm glad to hear that it's working, it's coming through, because it's one of those things that I try to work tonally into a poem. So
Mhm. Well, you do it so seamlessly. It's like you have to, I don't know, I find that I have to read your poems many times. I want to. And I every time I read it, I think I was saying this before that it's like diving into an ocean, and every time you hit a different depth, and so it just resonates. It rings in a different way a little bit, and it's like it's just so nuanced.
thank you. I
Yeah,
thank you. I do. I try to layer, and sometimes it works and sometimes it's just confusing. And so
yeah, of
trying to
course.
find that balance where I don't lose the reader is something
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
always striving for, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So how do you, I do have one follow-up question, which we can talk about now or later because I'm curious, but
Yeah, we can talk about anything now. Yeah,
yeah,
it's fine.
how do you teach yoking disparate things to your students?
Hmm.
And do you have any advice?
That's a really good question. I oftentimes will have them take a look at poems and look at their texture and looking about um because we talk about the image, we talk about the line, we talk about all those different parts, but one of the things that I like to do in thinking about tone and thinking about the image is how does it create texture and how are those layers starting to evoke the emotional landscape of whatever it is that's in the poem. And so um, I teach by models, right? So I oftentimes will just bring together some poems that I feel like do that combination in interesting ways, and spend some time just looking at like what happens when you juxtapose these things, what happens when you make the leap between one versus the other, and what is that doing for the emotion of the poem. Um, I don't have like a particular exercise or anything like that, but mostly it's just like observing it in poems that I love, and poems that sort of provide those surprises for me.
That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah. And that's really good to bring up that you're both teachers actually and teach really different things, which I find
Mhm.
fascinating now.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I maybe just do you want to talk a little bit now? I thought your question, Shannon, was just really beautiful about the uh, questions and the question lines in a poem, and how do you weave those in, or um, yeah, what does it mean to you to come up with those? Because they are just like breathtaking. Um,
Yeah, and if I could add really quickly on,
Please.
it seemed like in many, not all, but in many of your introductions of the poems, you would explain the question that you were mulling over. And so I guess a companion question to the question would be, do you start a poem with a question,
Mhm.
or do you start it with an image, or how do you start a poem?
Yeah, I oftentimes will start with an image and then the image leads to the question, right? And so sometimes I'm not a person who hears the music of the line in my head first. I'm not a person who thinks of like, oh, this is the narrative I want to render. For me, it's oftentimes a detail or an image that gets caught in my mind. I'm very much a lyric poet in this way, in the sense that like there's this thing that hits me and I don't understand why. And so I keep thinking about it. And so in thinking about it, I start asking questions about it. And that's what leads me to figure out why this particular detail or image seems significant to me. And so in referencing what I was saying earlier, like that sometimes leads the poem to find something very clear for myself or for the reader. And sometimes it means I'm like running around in circles trying to figure out what I'm trying to say, and because I can't figure it out, it doesn't make sense to somebody else, right? And so like becomes part of my revision process, or even is this something that's worth exploring further for myself or for somebody else that's reading? So it's the image, and then the image leads to a kind of question of why is this significant to me, or what significance could I make from whatever image is I'm obsessing over in that particular moment.
Yeah, I love that.
Me too. Yeah. And I like it that, yeah, that you're not really starting with a story as much as um, an idea or an image, as you say, and then seeing where it takes you.
Yeah, I'm not very good at storytelling. Like
Mhm.
I have to write short stories. There is no plot. Like string of moments. Sometimes when I'm telling stories about my day to people, like they're like, okay, what's the point of that? I'm like, I don't know, I'm just telling these little moments.
Yeah.
And so it translates into how my brain works.
Mm.
So yeah.
Well, when they get to the book and when you read them, I trust that you actually do run around and have to revise, right? But when they get to this point, it's almost like, oh, really? Like they're just so perfectly edited, in my opinion. So
You appreciate that.
Yeah. So let's see. Anything else we want to talk about now? Let's see if there's anything in the chat. Mary Marcia says she liked the flower flutters shut. It's a beautiful. Yeah. Do you have yeah, do you have a lot of flowers? I'm trying to think. I think you do. We've got
Um,
all the oranges. My God.
The poppies.
How many
yes,
ways can you describe orange? It's fabulous.
yeah. Strangely, I think I only have two poems with flowers.
Okay.
And two with bees, and yet both of those got read tonight.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if there's anything else in the chat. A lot of kudos, yeah. So is there anything else you want to say, Helena, before we move to Shannon or?
I'm looking forward to hearing Shannon read and then the
Mm,
conversation afterwards for sure. Yeah,
mhm. Yeah, me too.
for your
Well,
kind comments.
why don't you introduce Shannon?
Okay. Um, I'm I wrote something down because I'm not so good off the cuff. um, as was sort of mentioned already, so I've known Shannon for 14 years. So 14 years ago, a good friend called me and said, "You should meet Shannon." And so he said, "She's a poet. She lives in Ann Arbor, and you'll get along." And I was like, "Okay." And this would have been back in the days of like first communicating with people over Facebook, and so it was like Messenger and then email before we could actually get together. But it's hard to believe that it's been almost 14 years since I've known you. And it's almost 14 years of conversations over coffee, texts, and phone calls about dogs and teaching and poetry and cats and art and eclipses and where to get the best ice cream wherever we are. Shannon's poetry often captures quiet moments that surprise and delight with unexpected imagery that's rooted in the ordinary and cast in extraordinary and vivid ways. And I cannot assert this enough. Like, I am enthralled by Shannon's images. In her poem Pitch, she writes, "Some would call it inattention, but meaning blooms between quietness and cadence. A musician and conductor meander through a field. The striking lines are almost an ars poetica, capturing the power of her poems, of how she turns her eye or ear to the world. She often draws on unexpected associations and wordplay that at first seem, well, simply playful. But as the poem unfolds, Shannon always transports you to a new place, a place where she reveals the nuances of human experience and emotion. Whether the poem responds to art, re-envisioning what's inside and beyond the frame, or whether Shannon uses form in inventive ways, from a traditional sonnet to archival footnotes, her poems always enthrall. As Dickinson says, when I read her poems, I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off. I love her poetry, and I am honored to be reading with her tonight, and I'm so excited to hear her poems and that you all also get to hear her poems. So please help me in welcoming her and giving her her reading.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm having so much fun, and I think I knew that it would be amazing, and it's all the more so just to be in conversation with you and to talk about our work together. So thank you so much, Phyllis, for helping us make this happen. Because it's honestly something that we've dreamed about for a while. So as both Helena and Phyllis have mentioned, a lot of my work is ekphrastic. That is a response to works of art. And I'll only say that part of what inspired me about this was I'm joking, but like a middle school trauma. I love to paint and I love to make stories, and I got an A+ on my story and a C on my drawings. And the comment that I got from my teacher at the time was stick to poetry. So I did, but I kind of joke that I'm a failed visual artist, which I kind of prefer that way. Anyway, so the first poem I'll be reading for you tonight opens my collection, and it's called Ways to View Jean Miro's Triptych Blue 1, 2, 3. Start with the left and you'll see rain on a windshield after a storm. Begin with the right, and you'll see only a kite string drifting against the sky. There are 1,000 ways to begin a story. With the middle, perhaps, is best. With a red sewing needle stitching up black holes. Or maybe they aren't holes, but pebbles skimming the water seconds before they sink. There are also a million ways to interpret a story. The way I took my lover's silence for indifference, the way she thought my idle chatter was irreverence, the way I sometimes thought my sneaking to her house in the middle of the night was so lonely, our secret rendezvous collecting like black dots against a blue canvas. But then again, how lovely the snow fell all around me as I trekked back and forth between her house and mine at midnight. The sidewalk appeared like black ovals beneath my feet where the snow had melted. These tiny openings, how easy silence seemed, chosen, not imposed, like something I could lean into, like a simple red sliver, a blot of paint, to embroider, decorate, to strip back, cut. Yes, maybe this is the best way in. So a lot of my exploration with painting and with works of art became a way for me to grapple with personal trauma. And one of the things that I really admired from my mentors is I would initially create descriptions of canvases and paintings, and I really got into the images and imagery, and they all asked me a really hard but important question, which was, well, the painting or artwork already exists, so what are you adding to it? Like, why is this poem necessary? So I think one of my biggest kind of growth moments in terms of this book was thinking about how to interweave my personal story with the canvas. Self-portrait in white while viewing Salvador Dali's figure at a window. Like me, Dali hid his grievances in the hem of a girl's dress, in the thick blue stripes running down her back. In art, they call mistakes or amendments mid-stroke pentimento. I call them silence. 9 years old, I'm sitting by my father on the front porch, watching lightning slice the sky. We've run out of things to say. Me, his greatest regret. A daughter, not a son. Him, mine. A father I could no longer talk to. If grief were color, it would be white. I'm sure of it. The girl in the painting leans against the windowsill. What was she thinking? The window opens onto the Mediterranean, a sailboat and mountains. In the glass pane, I glimpsed the reflection of a small white house in the distance. If only I could step through the canvas, climb out the window and over waves to this threshold. I would turn the brass doorknob and feel my way through the strange, yet not altogether unfamiliar space as my father recedes into the background. I would call the girl sister, this place my home. So the fun thing about telling people you're working on ekphrastic poems is that then they get to send you wonderful and strange things. And so at a certain point, while working on my thesis, I had friends send me, oh, did you see this on YouTube? Did you see this somewhere else? And so the collection became about paintings, but also about photography. And this poem is called The stories we tell, fox in a block of ice. And it was the photograph is of a frozen fox that had tried to cross a river in Germany in the winter. The stories we tell, fox in a block of ice. I shouldn't, but I find it beautiful. The way its paws lift slightly as if still clawing the air. Its yellow fur, somehow softer, more vulnerable, pressed against ice, which amplifies its body like magnifying glass. The spots on its back, the black fur around its neck. This is as close as I will ever get to surrender. Except its face is submerged in cracks too thick to see through, as if the river that froze it also wanted to protect it from those who would later marvel at it, forgetting, as I do, that it's not just a piece of art. I lean in closer, as if looking for a story I can learn from, one about cold temperatures, difficult crossings, eyes that never shut. So there are some language and wordplay poems in this collection, and I love puns. I love puns and I love wordplay. And at first, I thought that my collection was going to be about languages. I have a comparative literature background. I spent a year living in France and lived in Italy. Um, and the art definitely kind of became a central focus, if not obsession, in this collection. But I also found myself thinking about the potential for pun and wordplay to transport us elsewhere. And I think you'll see that in the next poem. Word games and space travel. And this is after a Michael Thompson painting, and the painting is called Girl with a Hole in Her Stocking. And just in case you're interested, I'll describe it briefly. It's a girl leaning down and she notices a rip in her stocking. A hesitation, a hole, a rip. Sometimes my thoughts proceed like this, like a teasing at the seams where one thread loosens, then another, only to contract elsewhere. The way I think splinter, then sister. Oh, the association games she and I played to pass the time. Fall, she'd say. Trampoline, I'd reply. Corkscrew, curls. Syllables stitched up the hours. Almond, eye, telescope. What do you see? A blue earring lost in the baseboards. Through our games, it morphed into a blueberry, a raindrop, a lake big enough to swim in. What do you feel? Felt, cloth, velvet. My tongue explored each word, probing the space between letters. Space, a blank, to space, to forget. Outer space, me and my sister, two astronauts tasked with discovering dark matter, Big Dipper's, Orion's belt. All of it hidden in a C or an O, galaxies nestled in unsuspecting letters. Even now, my fingers pick at snags in my nylons and pull, unravel, gravel, travel to glimpse what lies beneath, behind, beyond. Thank you. I'm going to read a poem that I wasn't going to read, but it's on the next page of my book. And this has some French in it. One of my early memories with my mother was making bread. And so I think the only thing you need to know is tourne plus pouce plie is the movement you make and what you say in French while you're kneading dough, which I think I made clear, but just as a reference. And this is called remnants. Tourne, pouce, plie. 3 words my mother taught me while kneading dough. Bent over the counter like Vermeer's astronomer, I traced shapes in the flour. Turn, push, fold. The foreign assemblage of words rose on my tongue. Tourne, pouce, plie. My mother sprinkled water on the counter as light filtered through the kitchen window. Turn, push, fold. Air bubbles nestled in yeast burst like comets. The oven's pale yellow coils bluing. Rock, dust, ice. The heating and cooling and reheating of particles in the making. So when I was young, I had and still I can kind of feel it myself, had a speech impediment, and I worked really hard through speech therapy. But the hardest letters for me to say were S and SH, which especially in my teenage years bred a lot of angst. This is called When the Speech Therapist Told Me to Say the Letter S, I Opened My Mouth, and the title runs into the poem. When the speech therapist told me to say the letter S, I opened my mouth and nothing. I tried again, nothing, nothing, a thorn wedged between my teeth, beauty's sharpest edge. I've always fumbled over the most basic tasks. Again and again, my tongue rubbed until it bled. Try to say your name, she urged. Say anything. So I will read just one more from this collection and then just a few new ones. Palindrome. And for those of you who don't know, a palindrome can be read forward and back. So like 2002 is a palindrome. Palindromes. Out on the Port Townsend ferry, I watched seagulls rise, then dip along the horizon. 2 men warred over chess as a girl twirled in a blue polka-dotted dress. A woman in a sun hat skimmed a book with pages so thin I thought I could see right through them, could see each letter reflecting back at me in the salt water in the midday sun. Saw spelled backwards is was. Noon spelled backwards is noon. Some things are harder to name. My love, what I never dared call my lover who I kissed behind the azaleas in the park. Fumbling through her blouse, I touched the fault line just north of a north, past the seesaw and monkey bars where desire resides. Chair in French means flesh. Fear inverted is nonsense. But level spelled backwards is level. Dust unfolded at eye level as we touched. Her skin was wet with dew and shadows of upturned leaves. Boat-shaped, they slid over us, casting silhouettes in the tenderest spots, between joint, muscle, bone. Reprise again, in reprise, amend. Again and again, our hands searched at loss and gave it sails, then watched it drift from view. Thank you so much. So I'll just read a few more. I don't know if any of you saw the documentary, My Octopus Teacher. So after I finished my book, I just started writing poems about material that was interesting to me, and I fell in love with that documentary. So this poem is called My Octopus, and it appeared in Night Heron Barks. My octopus. Some days she escapes her tank and lurks at the base of my bed. In the dark, her eyes scan the room. I've lived my whole life under her microscopic gaze. Sometimes she spoons me like a mother would, and half asleep I surrender, mistaking her gesture for love. Her suction cups move as if to cradle my head. My pulse throbs against her three-chambered heart. What does she want from me? Her fat arms squeeze me tighter, tighter. I reach out to trace her regeneration and marvel at her knotted scars, at the lengths she's gone to protect herself, a body that will only fight until her first child is born. And I just have a few short ones. The newborn. Barely 5 pounds, 8 ounces, she sleeps before me and snores through her half open mouth. She clenches her tiny palms, tight chest, fisted heart, tight, tight. Sweat trickles down her cotton onesie. She furrows her brow, soggy with worry and sadness. She will spend a lifetime confusing those feelings. I want to undo these lessons for her. No one will want to hold this sticky, too clingy baby, especially in summer when the air sags around her. How do I teach her love? Her face, my face, I would recognize her anywhere. Great, thank you. And this will be my last poem, which I wrote after a doctor's visit. X. X marks the spot where the needle went in. X is the shape of the 3 millimeter pin they slipped into my right breast. It will stay there forever or a long time, or at least for now. The tiniest marker to show the doctors where the calcifications are. X marks the spot where white flecks cluster like petals of baby's breath against the darkness of the X-ray. Yes, X marks the spot where there's something, maybe nothing, for now, for a long time, forever. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you, Shannon. Let's yeah, let's all come back together now and just try to, I don't know, uh, just gobsmacked with beauty and almost speechless. Yeah. Um, that was such an amazing reading. What do we, yeah, I see a lot of stuff coming up in the chat. Yeah. Um, Lots of lines that people really liked. So many beautiful descriptions. Um, and the way that you weave the paintings into your emotions and the poetry. So yeah, what can let's start with that. And if anybody wants to participate from the audience, just raise your hand, your virtual hand, and we'll if I don't see it, somebody else let me know and we'll have you join in too. So yeah, Helena, what would you like to say?
I thank you. That was a really lovely reading. I loved hearing poems from the book and then also these newer poems. I too jotted some lines to put some of them into the chat, but some, like, if grief were a color, it would be white. Excuse me. I shouldn't, but I find it beautiful at the start as a way of starting the Fox poem, which so immediately engages me because I think, like, wait, what? It's got like that grit to it, right? This is as close I will ever get to surrender, the way things splinter, then sister, beauty's sharpest edge. I just really, there were such lovely lines and details. And I also, it has a longer title, when the speech therapist, sorry, I'm blanking out on the title right now, but the way that it's so brief and yet the title is so long and it just sort of weaves in. It's, the poems are really beautiful in capturing what you were describing as personal trauma, like that phrase that you used at the start of the reading. I felt like you do this amazing job of weaving between the artwork and the personal, and then that meditative voice that can so quickly move from meditation to description to telling the narrative. And I thought that was really interesting and exciting. But I was wondering, because I was thinking about the two groups of poems that you were reading, and I was thinking about, I had like two questions for you, just like, if, just to get us going. But I was thinking, like, maybe I'll ask the second one first. Like, you've spent so much time looking at art as a way of writing poems. And so I was wondering, now that you're writing poems that, I know you're also writing poems in response to art still too, right? But with the ones that you read, can you talk a little bit about how you think responding to art poems, responding to art and writing ekphrastic poems has shaped the way you're writing these newer poems? Do you feel like it's guided you in some way or helped you see things in a different way? Or
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say absolutely has, and I love starting a poem with a constraint. And so whether it's thinking about a visual constraint or with the poem The Newborn, I really wanted to have like super short lines. And I'm forgetting how many lines I have, but that was an exercise in concision. And I just recently, as in yesterday or the day before, learned about the pangram, which I had never heard of before. And so for those of you who don't know what it is, it's one sentence long, a poem that's one sentence long, and you have to use all the letters of the alphabet. And so I love kind of thinking about what you can do with that, because I think it's not that there are so many different ways when I sit down to write a poem that I think I can go. And so it's really helpful to have a guiding principle, even if I abandon that later in later drafts.
that actually connects one of the other questions I had for you. You may have already started to answer this, but like, you think about form, well, every poet thinks about form, but when I'm looking at the forms of the Girl Talk to Paintings, but then also of these newer projects that you're working on, there's sonnets, there's prose poems, there's poems where you would think of the contrapuntal, right, where you've got like the two columns. And so can you talk about form a little bit more, like the way that you use form for play or for structure or getting you writing, like how do you turn towards or find your choice in form for your poems?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm starting to do that's pretty new. So I wasn't really doing this in The Girl Who Talked to Paintings, but now I started writing in prose poem form to begin with, or stream of consciousness, right? Like this is the scene, or to go back to what you were talking about, like starting with an image. So here are all of my ideas. And then I just start to play and think about, okay, well, what would this look like in tercets? What would this look like as a sonnet? And I would say that I think for the longest time, couplets, for whatever reason, were my default. It was like everything started as a couplet because that was how I was able to visualize the poem. And then I started kind of moving around and playing with the white space. And it's been really fun because I've started working with Google Docs and having like draft one in one file and then draft two. So, because I think at first when I started experimenting heavily with revision and form, I was worried about losing the original and like, well, what if I quote unquote make a mistake and veer into a form that doesn't work? But it's really nice because I'll have an entire folder devoted to one poem and then
Mhm.
version 1, 2, 3, 4. So I can always go back. And that has been really helpful in allaying my fear that I really felt at the beginning of like, what if I had the best version here and then mess it up for some reason?
No, no one else, worries about that, right? Oh, well, so yeah, Muriel has thank you for that, for the questions and the answer too. And I just want to add, Muriel says, the newborn in a way is observed like a painting, which I think is a really astute comment. And I was going to ask you, Helena says she starts with an image. Do you start with a narrative? I was wondering about that. Do you start with a story? And I was wondering if your poetry is slightly more narrative than Helena's, but I don't know if that's true.
I think that might be true. I think that could be, I think that's definitely fair. And one of the things that was challenging for me in writing this collection, but I learned a lot about it, is I'm a very linear thinker. And so my friends always tease me because they used to say, like, how was your day? And I would start at the beginning and give them a blow by blow of the entire day. And then like half an hour later, they were like, no, we just want like the 2 sentence of your day. So it actually took quite a while to learn how to jump around, but I think that's true. I think it's that I start from some kind of narrative premise and then I sort of keep that on the back burner and then think about an opening line through sounds. So a way of starting the poem.
Yeah, and Helena, when you start with an image, do you have an idea of what you want to write about, or is it more that you just let the image take you wherever it takes you? Or is it both?
It can be both. It's oftentimes I've got an image and I am grappling with what that is. But sometimes if there's something, like if I really have ideas in mind that I've been thinking through that I know I want to write about, then that helps me find the image, right? So the image comes to me because I'm already thinking about that particular thing, right? So like I think when we were talking earlier about questions, with writing this book, I had a really hard time finding the order and finishing it until I finally
Oh,
made
right.
myself write down the question I was really thinking through. And once I finally figured out what that question was and literally wrote it down on I think it's still on the wall behind me. I suddenly the poem started to come very quickly because like the last poems that I needed to write just needed to find the direction that would hopefully hold the collection together.
Yeah.
So in that case, the image came because I was already thinking about a very clear idea.
Yeah, yeah. And actually that brings me to the question we had about how you arrange the books and how the placement of the poems, because that's really such an art too. And I was wondering if you want to talk more about that, each one of you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start. So I had sent my book out, I think for about a year and a half, and had gotten very mixed reviews, mostly like forum rejections. And then I was a semi in a few places. So it was like at every point where I sort of felt like giving up, I would like, oh, I was a semifinalist, so I'm gonna keep plugging along. But I wrote to a friend and said, you know, I don't know what to do with this. I'm sort of at this stage. And she said, okay, well, give me the weekend and I'll just spend some time with it. And
Oh,
um,
wow. I want the friend's name. Did that in a weekend for you.
um, and you know, I think it's so helpful to have readers, and my
Yeah.
book is made possible by so many people and so many collaborations. But this
Yeah.
friend said, you know, I think you're ending where you should start. And I said, what? And you know, it was a strange idea for me, but I did. I started. So when I read palindromes about the words, the reversed words,
Yeah.
that book is, sorry, that poem is one of the last in the book. And I had actually opened with that. And
Oh, really?
and I had closed the book with Ways to View Jean Miro. And she said, no, I think that verse, the poem Ways to View Jean Miro is really a metaphor for how to read the book as a whole. So it was really through
Yeah.
guidance. And she helped me see probably the first 5 poems or 7 poems. And then from there, I was able to take her cue. But it also, for me, I think was helpful. And I wanted to have sections, but I didn't want to have too many sections. But I title each section a different title. So I won't name them all, but um for example, a first draft, a sketch is the title of one, or solitude leaves its own kind of mark. And so it was really helpful for me. And the first section is called Vantage Points, to really think, okay, well, what is this section doing? Because I found that I really love people's books where it's just like Roman numeral 1, but I found myself getting lost in my own book without kind of headers for each
Yeah.
section.
Yeah. Yeah. And Helena, how about you?
I really struggled with the order. It was 3 sections, that it was 4 sections, that it was 3 sections. Um, I finally, like, I knew emotionally what I wanted the arc to be. So I wanted poems of estrangement, my mother's departure from Cuba, those kinds of things that come at the very start. And I wanted there to be a sense of coming together, um, for my mother, but then also for my understanding of my mother, but then also of like the relationship where like the poems of that were about romance, like love, right? That it would end on us being together in some way. Um, and so when I finally, when Terrapin Books picked up the book, Diane Lockwood sent me some edits, and she said, what if you flipped section 1 and 2? It was like the only real edit she gave me. And it freaked me out. I spent a lot of time going, what? No, I don't know. Like reading it, going upstairs, like going back and forth, not being sure. And then I was talking to a friend who commutes 2 hours from LA to San Diego and back again. And so to teach. And so he was on his drive home. And I was like, I don't know what to do. And he said, talk through it. And there was something about having to simplify it to somebody who was driving and listening to the arc of your book, that I suddenly had to say it very clearly on what I thought was happening. And his response was like, well, duh, she's right. It was very much like, what? And he's like, why are you starting with the mother? The book is not about your mother. The mother is standing in to talk about closeness and separation, and it's one thing. And if you start with the mother and her departure, then from Cuba, then it is all about her. And so it naturally allowed me to see what was happening. So the collection starts with some childhood poems, but then also like the first section or 2 talks a little bit about things in the world that challenge the speaker the version of myself as a younger person, but then also as an adult, like that struggle to connect and that inability to connect. And by the end, it ends on a poem that's very much about connection. And it could be the mother, it could be a lover, it could be somebody else. It's not, it's undefined. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's really fascinating to hear about, how it's a lot of work to figure that out. I mean, sometimes it falls into place, but often, and I certainly can relate to that. The editor says, "Well, we really want this poem, but can you just take out this one line, right?" And then call your friend right away.
Yeah.
They want to take out this line. What do you think? Is it okay? Yeah, it's like really, sometimes it's hard to be objective about it, right?
Yeah.
So
When
yeah.
you get so attached to what you think something is that you have to make it strange again in order to really or distance yourself in some way to really be able to realize, oh wait, they're right, or oh, maybe they're not right, but maybe they're making me see something else that I wasn't seeing.
It's really just like on a larger level. I think that's true in all sorts of ways. So I did want to mention that in the chat there were a couple of people talking about the Catholic Church experience, and and that the idea that God is in you and knows everything about you, and how much they could relate to that, having gone to Catholic school. And I so they wanted to talk about that a little bit. And I just wanted to add that, the way you write about the traumas of being alive, and the families, and it's I think it's so skillfully done, and anything you want to say about that too. So, and I do really want to invite people who are here to ask questions if you want to comment about this or anything else. But yeah, why don't you maybe start talking about, getting teased as well. I thought that was so heart-wrenching. And then Shannon, some of your poems too that are just so painful, and you make it beautiful. So I don't know if I'm asking a question really, but
I think having been raised, I'm just thinking about the Catholicism part that you were raising or bringing up. I come from a family that's very religious. There's a nun in my family. Went to Catholic grade school, middle school, and was about to go to the Catholic all women's high school that my sisters had been in. It was a week before classes started. I had the uniform, I had taken the placement exams, I had the schedule, and walked into my parents' bedroom, cried and said, "You can't send me there. You have to send me to the public school." Because the experience in the schools that I had been in and my own questions about faith, I knew it was the wrong place for me. But I was also raised by a father who was an atheist, but who pretended to be Catholic and would fall asleep in church every single Sunday. So like there was always these mixed emotions, and I always found it really strange to be in a place where the kids and the teachers and the nuns, there was these two-sided things going on, right? Where the kids would be mocking you and the teachers wouldn't do anything, or the teachers would pick on certain students. There were like always these things that didn't make sense to me in a place that was supposed to be spiritual. So I don't know, I think it shaped me. Like it shaped how I saw the world. Like I think that was one of the things, and then living abroad was the other thing. Like those two things shaped my vision of who I became. And so it's not surprising to me that in this collection I'm looking back to some of those moments. Not sure if that answered, but
yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in really quickly and say, yes, I was teased a lot, in part because, so my poem, The Newborn, was inspired by the fact that I spent the first 6 months in the hospital and then the first 18 months of my life in a car seat, because if I were to lie down, I would have stopped breathing. And so I had a lot of
Wow.
developmental delays. And so I had a lot of speech therapy. I had, because I was in the car seat for so long, I actually had very little neck muscle. So I had to go to I don't know if they call it a neck therapist, a physical therapist, but I did physical therapy, speech therapy. And so a lot of things took me a really long time to learn how to jump. Um, so I have some jump rope poems because my feet just like I just couldn't get the hang of it. And so that poetry became one of the first places I turned to really explore being made fun of and teased, but
Mhm.
also a way it was like reclaiming a sense of agency, because I still had a lot to learn as a poet, and was very I was in high school then, but poetry became a way of like re-narrating it in a way that I felt better about myself and the situation. And
Mm,
I would say the same about narrating my estrangement from my father, that poetry really became a way of, okay, well, there are so many things that I can't control in this situation, but I can control the poems I write about it.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Well, so there's a question here from I think it's Muriel. For Helena, tonight you used several one-word titles. Will you talk a bit about what emphasis you put on the title? It's a good question. In conjunction with us, I'm sorry, in conjunction with and as separate from the rest of the poem, whether you were trying to guide or entice the reader or question mark. And that's really for both of you.
It's a really good question. I find that titles are, for me, in the writing process, something that anchors me. Oftentimes the title comes to me very early, and if it doesn't come to me very early, I really struggle to name something. So I think there was Legend Offering and Recess, I think were the three one-word titles tonight. Um, and I feel like those three are doing three different things for me. For Offering, I wanted to set a kind of tone, where the cat is like, here are these dead mice. But then of course there's that turn in the end, about um, like hurting people that we love, right? Right. And so I wanted the title to set a particular tone that the poem's going to flip as it was working against. Um, I think for Recess, it was on one hand super practical, like we were in recess at school, right? It's like giving the setting. Um, but I also wanted to think about the different meanings of recess as well, in the way that that poem is moving, both as a sonnet and then also in the recesses of my memory and my mind. And so I was thinking about that word in multiple ways. Um, and then Legend was uh, because there's so many different myths, sometimes accurate myths, sometimes um, adaptation of myths within the collection. A legend just felt like another way of speaking to myth. And I wanted something like, for me, that title was connecting it not only to the poem, but connecting it to the book. So I think that the poem titles are guiding, and sometimes I'm hoping that they will bring you in, but I'm hoping sometimes that they'll give you different layers of understanding afterwards. And I think like my favorite titles are actually the ones where, because I'm such a lyric poet, is when all the narrative gets shoved into the title. So then I can just focus on the lyric moment and let the narrative be like, you know, in its hat. And like that's one of my favorite ways of titling. So Shannon, do you want to say something about titles as well?
Yeah. So this is so interesting because I really struggle with titles. It's the last thing I think about. So it's really cool to hear that it's one of the first things you think about. And for a while all of my poems were Untitled 1, Untitled 2, Untitled 3. I think often with the ekphrastic poems, I try to put some kind of orienting information about the painting and then intersection with the personal material. But more and more, I'm trying to think about the title as either supplemental to what's going on in the poem or totally at odds with the poem. So there's a really interesting prompt about, title your poem something, like while shopping for groceries at the supermarket, and then like you don't mention the supermarket at all in the poem. So I think about that a lot. I also can sometimes use titles to highlight a particular word or phrase so that the poem is read through that lens. But I find titles very difficult. The irony though is that I came up with the title The Girl Who Talked to Paintings before the poem. So there's a titular poem in this collection that carries that name, and it was way too long to read. Tonight it's a sonnet sequence and series, and this was one of those painful but really necessary things to hear from the same editor friend. And she said to me, I think the weakest poem in your collection is The Girl Who Talked to Paintings. And I was just beside myself. I just thought, oh, you've like ripped the ground out from underneath me, which she totally hadn't. It was the best gift she ever could have given me, because after a couple hours of kicking, I realized she was totally right. The poem was maybe the least interesting because it wasn't really working with the layers of the personal and the canvas. And so that poem I revised very substantially and engaged with, and then have the collection that is. But that's really the only poem that I've started with a title and then sort of about it afterwards, like how the poem would.
And that one was the one that didn't work. That's funny.
Well,
Didn't work as well.
yeah. Well,
But it
and
worked for the book, yeah.
it did, and I think that part of it was that I realized that in the original poem, which I'm thankful for, and I like very much, but it was just like one form of talking to artwork, and in the collection now I've expanded point of view and time and space in a way that I think slash hope captures the multiplicity of the interaction with the artwork a lot more than the original.
Mhm. So, what I want to say is I'm I'm trying to remember which one of you it was. I get a lot of poems in my inbox, and one of your poems came into my inbox. I think it was Shannon, but I'm not sure. Was it you? Yeah. And then,
Yeah.
yeah. And I just happened to be looking for readers at that moment. I didn't know you. I had no idea who you were. And but I thought, okay, I'm gonna just take a leap and ask you if you want to read.
Oh, sorry, I misspoke. You emailed me about a poem, but I think you contacted Helena,
Yeah,
and
see, and here I am getting you mixed up again. I'm sorry if that's
no
No,
problem.
no worries. It
really
was
frustrating for you.
no, not at all. It was it was the incantation which I read tonight. It was the guzzle. It was one of the reasons why I chose to read that one, because I was like, hey, that's
Oh,
like
okay. Well, thank you for
the
reminding me. My
I know it's
memory
all
can
good.
be
It's all
somewhat
good.
layered.
Well,
Yeah. So
and I misled you because I had a poem in
about
swim
hearing aids, yes.
and I'm going to read at the end of our time together. So
Oh,
that's
good.
what I
Yeah.
thought you were.
And
Yeah,
I
that's
just
what
was
I thought
like,
you were referring to.
yeah,
Yeah.
that is I want to write a hearing aid poem too. So when I do, I'll have to send it to you. Yeah. But so I just kind of took a leap because I really didn't know you, Helena, at the time. And then you said you were going to invite Shannon, and I'm just really. And then when I heard tonight that it was a dream that you would read together, it just really was just so fulfilling to me. I'm really happy that it worked. really happy. I don't often say this, but I really want people to read your books, and I want everybody to read everybody's book, and all the readers I've had, I want people to read their books. So um, I just think these books are just something to really open up to, and there's so much in there. And I just to briefly mention, and I think we'll put it in the YouTube when we have the when we get the video up and running. But there are also some reviews that are online of both of your books that might be helpful to read. It was helpful for me to read in terms of understanding more what you were trying to do, or that reviewer's point of view, and then hearing more from you tonight, of course, makes it even better. Yeah, I hope that people will uh, take a moment to enter your world, because it's just really wonderful.
Thank you. It's kind of you to say that. I really appreciate it, because I feel like it's always such a gift when somebody is willing to read your work. And so thanks.
Mhm. Yeah, you're welcome. And
Thank you.
I don't, yeah, I say it with it's not, I'm not doing this to try to sell books. If that happens, that's great. It's more for me, it's like that for people to have the experience. And how do we, how do we find out about all these amazing books? There's so many, right? And so it is sometimes, if you don't know about something and then you hear about it, it's such a gift. So on that note, maybe we can have you read a closing poem, and we'll finish up.
Sure. Thank you all for coming, and this has been delightful. This poem is called Pitch. What did you say? My mother asks me every day. She tunes her hearing aids 1 millimeter up, half a one down. A musician with a tuning fork. Walking down the street, I crank up the music. A conductor of a concerto, a jam session, a pop refrain. Louder, louder. Notes flower in my earbuds. What did you say? I ask my mother almost every day. Some would call it inattention, but meaning blooms between quietness and cadence. A musician and conductor meander through a field. They press their ears to the ground. Thank you.
Oh.
That was beautiful. Thank you. And again, thanks to everyone for coming. And thanks, Phyllis, for organizing this and hosting us, and Lynn for all your tech work. I would love to end on a note of coming together and stepping towards a loved one, which is also the last poem of the book. Prayer for no country. Between my want and your want for me, I envision our universe, a kerchief, each tip gently pulled to its fuchsia center, the cloth creased and ironed. You will turn over the new square and repeat. My turn, your turn, and repeat, until we can no longer fold the cotton. Then you and I will occupy not a country, but a hard origami knot, each part of us pressed against the other. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, and thank you both. Thank you both so much. And thanks everyone for coming. And next time we're going to have Jennifer Martelli and January Gill O'Neill, and that'll be at the end of May. I hope people can make it. And thanks again, and we'll see you next time.